Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I am your host as always, Steve Hall, and we have Jeff Nippard on the show. And this is really going to be quite a fun chat talking about Jeff's off-season. And we did have Jeff on the show, I think over a year ago. We were just chatting. We weren't completely sure how long ago it was. And both of us, I think, have come an incredibly long way since then. And it's actually kind of shocking to even think about it. But Jeff, if you don't know, is a drug-free bodybuilder and powerlifter, has a Bachelor of Science in biochemistry. He's coached female bikini and men's bodybuilding and kind of coached at a high level, and is actually scaling that back slightly now and focusing on YouTube. So he's a massive content creator. I'm sure if you're watching this on YouTube, and you should pretty much probably leave this and go and search Jeff Nippard and go and look at all the great content he's got over there. He's got over 500,000 subscribers now, and it's actually kind of crazy to see how fast that's growing. And that's massive credit to Jeff because the content is fantastic. He used to have a podcast. You might have even seen Jeff's podcast, or rather might just be, it's still probably live actually. I think it is still live. You can still get those old downloads, which are fantastic. So definitely check that out as well. And I believe you have a competition this year. Are you in prep?
Actually, well, that's something we can get into. I'm on the fence about this year. It'll either be this year or next year. But yeah, there's something down the pipe.
Exciting eventually. Stuff. And I couldn't do an introduction to Jeff without stating that he's 5'5", because I remember seeing that on your Instagram and just like, classic. You must get asked that far too many times if you have to put it on your Instagram.
Yeah, man, I just try to own it really. But yeah, it is something I get asked a lot because, like, you know, especially in photos, I do look really muscular. So then people will see, you know, I'm 170 pounds and they're like, wait, something's not adding up here. How tall are you? So I just have to let everybody know.
No, I mean, the amount of questions I get on like Instagram about, like, I don't know, it could be something as simple as how I have oats, and it's like, what's your recipe for oats? It's like, it's just water and I don't measure it.
Yeah.
So people are just really intrigued by these things and the mystery behind it. But if you haven't seen Jeff, he is super jacked, and that is a big reason we've got him on, because he obviously walks the walk and talks the talk as well. So we're going to dive into kind of off-season lessons, because you've had, when was your last competition, Jeff?
I actually haven't competed since November 2015. So it's been a little over 2 years for me now. So yeah, I've got lots of firsthand experience with the off season, especially right now.
How's this off season gone compared to like previous off seasons?
I think, well, I actually think I'd have to dig back, but I think this is the longest break I've actually had from the stage. And I think other than like my immediate newbie period, is probably, I think, some of the best gains I've seen, especially in terms of like weak points that I've been trying to really hone in on. So yeah, I think that as a natural, especially an advanced natural, that long time to really like allow the muscle to cook is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I like the way you do that. You want to be well done. You don't want to be rare going out there.
Yeah, exactly.
I know personally, kind of, even I competed in 2014, then competed just the year gone in 3 years, and like, in reality, 3 years flies by. But the gains you can make, I mean, they can be impressive, but only if you really do cook it and you allow that time to really sink in, especially when you take into account recovery times and all these things. So I don't know where we want to start. Do we want to start with kind of your approach to your nutrition over your off season, whether that's changed over your off season, and kind of any lessons that you've made there? And you may talk and I'll end up finding something I want to delve into.
Yeah, sure. We can start with the nutrition stuff and then get into the training if you'd like. So for me, I would say one of the biggest things that's changed this year is that I've taken more or less a fully intuitive approach. I'm not sure how you feel about intuitive eating as a, I guess, dieting structure, but I found it to just be really good for me in terms of like my lifestyle right now. As you know, you probably know, like I'm putting a lot of effort into my content creation and the business side of things. And so I've just found that intuitive eating allows me to kind of like, I guess in a way, take a little bit of like my mental energy that would go into I guess fine tuning more of the things there, and then focus on some of the other things that are really important to me right now. And I don't find that it really compromises any results. And I guess more or less the basic way I do that, I would say the first thing is that I've got like at least 10, 11 years of experience with bodybuilding nutrition. So I guess over the course of that time, I've really sort of paid attention to what it is that works for me, in the sense of like what I can sort of get away with. That I think that's been really important, and that's allowed me to be more successful with it. And then also, rather than using nutritional variables, I guess, is my main metric. So like say, tracking the macros, I instead will track body measurements on the scale for the most part, and let that, rate of gain sort of determine whether I push forward or push harder with the nutrition or pull back a little bit. So that's basically been my like kind of simple guess and check method. And then other than that, I really try to focus on bolusing my protein intake across 4 to say 6 meals per day. And at this point, I know what roughly 30 grams of protein looks like, so I can estimate that pretty easily. Usually will come from like a high quality protein source. And then other than that, I try to focus on hitting my like fruit and vegetable requirements. So I've got a habit of eating 1 or 2 kiwis every day. I think that covers at least my vitamin C. And then, you want to be getting at least 2 to 3 servings of vegetables a day. And then at least that, I think, in fruit as well. And once I have those bases covered, just a general focus on eating nutrient-dense foods, foods that are higher in fiber when it comes to carb sources. And then other than that, I kind of just let the macros fall where they may. So that's been my general approach to nutrition. In terms of rate of weight gain, I've been going for about, roughly speaking, a pound a month. And I've been doing that with the purpose of actually trying to increase my body fat percentage, which is probably a little bit controversial within natural bodybuilding spheres, and we can argue about that. But I've basically found that carrying a greater body mass in total has basically allowed for greater performance in the gym, much better recovery, especially when it comes to recovery from some injuries that I've been battling with for the last couple of years. And then also where I've had this 2-year off season, I've just found that I just do look a lot bigger, especially in person and in clothes with that higher body fat percentage. So let's say over the last, I would say 6 months or so, I've pushed myself from something like 15% body fat, which is normally where I would cap it off. Like I would normally actually probably not even get there, up to now I just hit like 20%, and then I'll fluctuate between like 19 and 20%.
Wow.
And at this point, I feel very good. I feel more massive than I ever have, and like I said, my performance and recovery in the gym is really good. So at this point, what I had originally planned to do was to run a mini cut, get myself maybe back down closer to that 15-16% range, and then build my way back up. But what I've found is that it's getting actually quite difficult for me to actually gain any more fat. It's like my body really doesn't want it. And so I'm thinking if I can just keep piling calories in and continue to make this progress, I don't really see a need for me to mini cut at this point, especially since I should say I'm not sure if this is going to be the year that I'm going to be getting on back on stage. If it was, this would totally change. Yeah. But in the context of having another whole year, I think that this is the approach that makes the most sense for me right now.
No, it's really cool. Like you touched on so many interesting things there. And I think, to be honest, I think the most interesting thing that people will take from that is an advanced bodybuilder going quite probably far from your stage weight. I imagine you're a good number of pounds over that now, probably further than what most people recommend. And I think a large majority of our listeners will think of the kind of the golden zone for body fat being like that 10 to 15%. And if you go much over that, your kind of partitioning ratios are down, kind of regulated and things like this. And you touched on a point that I actually made a recent Facebook post, which is just really related to this, because I was basically saying how the percentage body fat for kind of partitioning ratios and that being a good place to stay is kind of good, all good, fine and dandy. But when we think about maybe a body fat settling range, or where we feel our best, basically, kind of if people think of set point theory, where your body fat likes to be or where your body likes to be and it feels good and productive. And my point was that training is the biggest stimulus for growth. And if you're feeling better at a certain percentage body fat, even if that is relatively higher, surely kind of progressive overloads, like the ability to recover and train harder, like you commented on, is all going to be greater. So you're actually seeing better gains. So actually it's kind of refreshing as well to hear that you've kind of taken that approach. Was it at all like a mental struggle? Like, did you ever think like this is hard? Like, especially as well, people would think you're an advanced bodybuilder, you're a pro, surely you're being meticulous with your nutrition. It kind of sounds like, hang on, Jeff's let his body fat go up and he's doing intuitive kind of eating. That's quite a relaxed approach. Were there any like mental struggles with letting go a little bit?
Not for me. And one thing I should say is that when I say 20% body fat, I actually think that that's an overestimate. I should say this because it really depends on the measurement tool, what kind of number you're getting. Sure. So I use bioelectrical impedance. It's a scale, and it basically estimates your whole body off of an estimate of your lower body. So it's an estimate of an estimate. And I think that I tend to store more of my body fat on my lower body, so my upper body can stay quite lean. Like I still have visible obliques, some striations in my shoulders when I'm training under good lighting, whatever. People probably wouldn't tend to associate that with 20% body fat.
Yeah.
And so I actually do think that this scale is consistently high in terms of what it reports, because I had a DEXA scan done, and I think the DEXA came out, this was when I was a lot leaner, but when I compared it to this scale, it was like at least 5% lower than what this scale was reporting. So maybe I may actually only be like a true 15%. But I think that also just drives home the point that these numbers are sort of yes. arbitrary to begin with, as long as you're using the same measurement tool over time. Then you're getting some kind of like consistent reading that you can use as a tool to measure changes, basically. But what was psychologically?
Yeah,
was it difficult? Yeah,
to see. I mean, especially as someone like yourself, like, and you. I mean, particularly, I can think of Lyle McDonald, who talks about when guys get bodybuilding shredded, their whole outlook on what lean is and what fat is changes. And obviously you've been there, and it's been a while now, but it's still recent enough to know what being shredded felt like. So yeah, and a lot of people struggle with seeing that body fat come on, and you're kind of striving to let it come up. Did you ever, was there any struggle with kind of experiencing that?
Not really, to be honest with you, because for me, I could be different than a lot of guys, but I actually feel more confident, more comfortable, like more stacked in my clothes when I'm bigger. I've always wanted, I guess, I've always kind of liked that more stacked look, especially like looking up to bodybuilders like, Lee Priest, Franco Columbo. Like those guys are my height, and they look massive. And that's sort of a look that I've always really liked. So the only way that I can attempt to emulate that is to be, I think, at a higher body fat percentage as a natural. Because when I get stage shredded, I'm like 150 pounds, which at 5'5" it's not a very big guy. I can look very big on stage with the proper posing, lighting, tan, and all of that sort of stuff. But just out walking around in the gym, or in a t-shirt or something like that, I look pretty freaking small, actually. So I would, from my own perspective, I would prefer to be bigger and stronger and, fill out my clothes a little bit better. And I feel like that's a helpful way for maybe guys to like sort of frame it, is like I kind of try to have that shift in perspective where you can accept a little bit more fat gain. But I have dealt with that in the past, of course. I've competed like 6-7 times now. So I've definitely dealt with that initial period where you're just seeing all this fat go on and you're not seeing any gains. And that can be a difficult period to push through. And I will say that there is always that, I guess, like inflection point, I'll call it, where like it feels like you're just fluffy now and like you just got a mini cut. But I feel like in my experience, if you can push past that point, you will start seeing new muscle go on. You'll start to see it maybe like redistribute or partition a little bit differently. And then your physique will start to take on kind of a new form. That's been my experience with it. A lot of guys who will start to be like, yeah, I'm going to embrace this mentality. I'm going to start the bulk. I'm going to get massive. And then they start to see like a little bit of chub around their midsection. They're like, I don't know about all this. Especially since, sometimes, especially, in good lighting, you know, with posing, you can actually look quite a lot worse if you're not as lean, and that can be really discouraging. But I encourage people to sort of push through that and sort of like embrace that mentality. I've been calling it bear mode, which is a term I've borrowed from Alex from Alpha Destiny, who's another YouTuber, and I did an interview with him. But I think it's a healthy mindset to embrace, and it does, like you said, you know, allow you to be a little bit less compulsive with the tracking and that sort of thing. It frees up a good bit of lifestyle flexibility as well.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really healthy approach to have, and it's kind of refreshing. I think a lot of people generally do struggle with that aspect, and when you think about focusing on performance, thinking about focusing on how you look in clothes rather than how you look naked, and keeping the long-term goal, like for someone who's advanced like yourself to get that big, like to gain any more muscle, like you need to almost force it to a big degree. So no, it's really interesting to hear. And along with the body fat percentage, and really good point there, because I was going to call you out on the 20%. I was like, you sure you're 20% body fat? That seems quite high for like how you're looking. But I mean, the fact that it distributes differently on different people. So I guess you're fairly fortunate in that it's more on the legs, because then you can kind of feel okay on the beach and things like this. And I know for myself, my face just explodes, kind of gets bulk face, and I'm like, oh, now it just looks chubby. So I think all of those things can play into it. And did you want to say something on that, Jeff? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, like if you're going to be someone who wants to give this a shot or embrace it, a big thing is body hair, facial hair. So, you know, you can cover up a chubby chin with a beard if you can grow one. And I found that to make a pretty big difference in terms of like just making you look like a bulked baby to making you look a little bit more masculine. And the same thing goes for the muscles. A lot of bodybuilders, as you know, will shave themselves squeaky clean, and that's good because it exposes the striations when you're lean. But when you're not lean, that just makes you look like a smooth baby. So I think you've got to be willing to like let the hair grow out a little bit. And I talked with Alex about this on my channel, and he references something in, I guess, art or sketching called cross hatching, which is basically like it adds a lot of texture to some kind of drawing when you add those cross hatches. Now, the striations serve this purpose when you're lean. When you're not lean, body hair can sort of fill in and cover that a little bit. You look at some of these like strongmen guys, right? These guys who are like 6'6", 400 pounds. I feel like those guys would just look so much softer if they didn't let their body hair grow out. So that's something I've done that's a little bit different this off season as well.
And I guess that even goes further into the bear mode mentality of the hair.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming all over. And no, I can agree. It's funny. I referenced growing out my beard when I was in contest prep because it kind of hid the cheekbones and all of that. And I know Pascal, the other coach at Revive Stronger, he's currently like bulky and he's grown out his beard because it kind of covers everything. So no, and really interesting to hear about the cross, like the actual art component of that and whether it draws the attention in the eye and things like this. So the other question I had for you actually was, so you were measuring body fat percentage via the bioelectrical impedance and also taking scale measurements. Were there any other measurements you were taking? Were you taking like girth measurements? Did you like take progress photos, anything like that?
Well, I'm always taking photos, so that's sort of that would be one thing. I have been measuring my neck actually, and that's another thing that I feel like we can touch on here, because I think that's another huge contributor in terms of like how impressive, how muscular and big you look in your off season is that neck and trap development, and it's something that a lot of bodybuilders, especially natural bodybuilders, neglect, and it's something that I've noticed every single time I've dieted down is that like this whole area here just completely disappears. My face gets like you just alluded to, right? You grew the beard in to try to hide just how like emaciated your face can look when you get that shredded, right? And it will just make you look a little bit more lively and healthy if you have that facial hair. But what can also really, really work is hypertrophy of the neck muscles. And that's something that I just realized in the last maybe year or two. And I feel like it has made a really big difference. And so when I started, my neck was actually really skinny, even for someone who like, genetically, like I have thick wrists, thick ankles. I have like, I guess what you'd call like the good traits for bodybuilding, in terms of like, the rounder muscle bellies, and that sort of thing. But my neck, for whatever reason, genetically is just always very slender. And then I have like more of a defined jawline, so it makes it almost look even more slender. And so one thing that I noticed was when I would diet down, that would just become more and more exaggerated. So I got to thinking, I think just like completely independently of anything I had seen, that like, the neck is a muscle just like any other muscle. You apply that tension stimulus to it, it's going to adapt. And so I started training it directly. And when I started, I think it was 13 inches or just under 13 inches when I first started. And now it's up to just over 15 and a half. So I've added like 2.5 inches. And so that is one thing that I directly measured. And that's been pretty motivating. 15 and a half inches is kind of like, not like huge. Like there are guys who are like wrestlers and stuff. They have like 18, 19 inch necks, and those are huge. But for me, going from like having what I would say like a skinny neck and like minimal trap development to even just like say like an average neck or like maybe slightly bigger, I would say has made a huge difference in terms of just like my overall presence.
And you think about kind of the neck, and you think about that increase in like 2 inches might not sound a lot to people, but when you think about the percentage increase that is, like that's quite a small kind of, necks aren't big, so to make any kind of inches of progression is massive. So no, that's really cool. And I think a lot of if listeners know anything about you, Jeff, I think they know the kind of the chat you've had on the kind of neck development and things, and I think it's definitely people are interested in. I think it is an overlooked area. I think a lot of people do think about the traps, but maybe just not the neck. And I know I personally never actually, I still haven't tried training my neck. It might be something I go down. I'm quite gifted in the trap development, it seems, but neck, I'm not so sure about neck. And actually, I'm slightly conflicted on the neck stuff. And you probably know it much better than me because I haven't actually looked into it. But when I just thinking about training my neck makes me kind of a bit uncomfortable, thinking about kind of, I've tweaked my neck before. That's never been nice. I wonder what the impact on other lifts could be. So I don't know if you actually want to delve into that right now, because I'm sure the listeners will be interested.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a legitimate concern. But like anything, I would say the main thing is to just, take it slow and progressive. You're not going to like jump in and do like, 45-pound plated neck curl your first time. You're going to slowly work your way up. And I think that as long as you're doing proper warm up, like anything else, I think that it's been very safe in my experience. And this is something that athletes have done really forever, as far as I know, especially like wrestlers, boxers, and they've always included these neck specific strengthening exercises in their routines. And if anything, I would say it just, would help you in terms of athletic performance, and especially if as a fighter. And so I would for sure not be too wary of that, and just apply the same basic safety principles that you'd apply really before training any muscle group in terms of like, dynamic warm up and pyramiding your way up in terms of weight, and then just being steady with the progressive increases over time.
I was just going to say, did you ever experience, obviously when we train muscle groups, like for the first time, we normally get a fair bit of soreness. I don't know if the neck is an area that actually particularly gets sore. Did you ever have like DOMs within the neck? And how did that go? Kind of, I guess that might put you off lifting. I mean, everything involves the neck.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely uncomfortable for sure. The first few times you do it, it's going to feel like, I mean, the expression goes like a pain in the neck. It's literally like meant to mean something that sucks. So it does. And yeah, it's just like any muscle, like you feel it, and it's just like to touch it, it's just sore. It's like any other muscle. One thing to be wary of if you are going to do it is something that they're called zingers, and it's basically like, how sometimes if you sleep the wrong way, you'll get like this kink in your neck where you like can't turn it to a certain side without it hurting. I've gotten a few of those, and I feel like they come from, in my experience, basically not warming up properly and doing weight that's too heavy for you with bad form. I've found a way in my training to just like completely negate those. And it's basically just been doing a full dynamic warm up. So side to side stretches, front to back stretches, doing head circles before training. I'll do like 30 reps of just direct neck curls lying down on the bench first. Then I'll do 30 neck extensions. And I also found this is just like personal experience, doing curls and extensions in many different planes of motion. So like, doing like diagonal curls, this sort of thing as a part of your warm up before jumping into the actual loading work has been really good at reducing the frequency of those. And I wouldn't say I've gotten one of those in like months and months and months. And now I guess like the repeated bouts effect has sort of started to kick in. I don't really get too sore anymore. But that's obviously not really driving anything anyway. So that's a good thing.
And with your neck training, did you kind of do it like you would with other isolation work, put it to the end of the workout, or did you kind of do it first? Because I don't know, it might have been safer to do it first potentially.
I would do it at the end, honestly. And this would be, I guess, like an impetus for me to want to skip it a lot of the time, because I would be like done training back for something and I'd be like, the neck, like, the judges, if we're being honest, like this isn't for bodybuilding, I don't think, because I don't know how much the judges are really taking the neck into account. So if you're purely a bodybuilder, you may not even really have to worry about this. I personally find it does add to the completeness of the physique. It's like sometimes, and I feel like even myself, I've been like this, is like you almost see like that's a photoshopped on head. And I feel like the reason for that is because there's no musculature to hold it. There's no neck musculature to hold it up. And a lot of natural bodybuilders tend to have that look to me, especially when you get like the really dark dream tan on the body and then the face is like a little bit paler and then it's like held up by like a skinny neck. It really does have a Photoshopped look.
Why can't I say the word popsicle stick?
Exactly.
Like lollipop head.
But that's probably just like one of my personal preferences. But I think that, in terms of like just looking more jacked in general, especially to like an unbiased viewer, I feel like it does carry more weight in terms of general impression than I think people tend to realize. One thing in terms of concerns that I would probably pay attention to is risk for the development of sleep apnea.
Right.
So if one of the major risk factors for developing sleep apnea is overdeveloped musculature of the anterior neck muscles. So if you do want to avoid that, you could probably just stick to developing the back of the neck by doing extensions and that sort of thing. But in my experience, that I obviously haven't had to deal with that. And I think that tends to happen when you start to get to like the really big neck circumferences, like, 18, 19 inches, then you start running risk of that. But up until then, like most of the natural guys who are like between like, 14, 15 inches, something like that, which is pretty normal, I'd say you can get away with it for quite a while before you have to really worry about anything like that.
Cool. And if people want to learn more, they can head over to your channel. I'm sure you've got loads of references going over this. Have you even got a guide on it, actually? Because you've got a load of guides on your website. Yeah. So I definitely recommend kind of go to source. Jeff's been doing it and kind of proof in the pudding. Your neck's grown a bunch. So in terms of, I know people want to hear about it. Your off season, obviously, it's been like almost 2 years. You talked about mini cuts. Have you done any cutting within those 2 years, or has it all just been steady kind of gains? What's happened in that time?
Yeah, I think I did a couple mini cuts. Let me think right now. I actually did one. I wouldn't even call it a mini cut. I would almost call it a full blown fat loss phase because I was getting ready for a few photo shoots. So I didn't get stage ready, but I actually got very lean. And then coming off of that, it's not like I've been doing this bear mode bulk for 2 years, by the way, which is part of the reason why I want to continue to extend my off season. Coming off of that, I did more of a lean bulk, which I feel like worked out really well for me. It actually allowed me to get to a point where I was still quite lean but very filled out. And that was a good look. But you know us, we're never satisfied. So I wanted to keep pushing that. And I think that that was when I really kind of started to embrace the whole bear mode bulk and see the merit behind that. So there was that one cut for the photo shoot. And then I did another little mini cut just because I felt like, things were getting a little bit, carried away in terms of the body fat more so than they needed to. So I cut down something like five pounds, maybe 5, 6, 7 pounds, and then just continued it again. And now I'm at a point where I feel like at this point I would normally run another one. But like I said, I feel like, man, just the performance benefits and the fact that, my caloric intake has gotten to be quite high. And I feel like at this point, my body is like resisting further weight gain. I feel like I can just keep riding this wave and just sort of like sit here at like that, like quote 20%, and see what it brings basically.
No, nice. And I guess that's kind of a nice insight for people to hear, because obviously, if you're gaining a pound, well, yeah, you haven't even been aiming to gain that pound every month, and doing that for that period of time, you'd obviously get quite far. In terms of, you talked about kind of calorie intake and intuitive eating, and do you have like awareness of, are you aiming to hit like a protein number? Are you aiming to kind of prioritize carbohydrates at all, or are you just letting kind of hitting protein, hitting kind of a rough calorie figure in your head? Once you've tracked for as many years as you have, you kind of understand where you are. Are you doing anything kind of, any precision there, or is it really quite flexible?
It's pretty flexible, to be honest with you. I would say, like, probably roughly speaking, I'm aiming for around 3,500 calories a day, just to give you some kind of ballpark. Keep in mind, my lifestyle is fairly sedentary. I do a lot of work at the computer, so that's actually quite high for me. When I'm contest prepping, I always have to dip below 2,000 calories. So I'm not one of those guys who can diet on super high macros. And then as for the protein, I don't track this very closely because I think that protein requirements while in a caloric surplus are actually pretty freaking low. It's like, it would be kind of hard for me not to meet it. So this is just something I don't think I need to be very anal about. But like I alluded to, I think that in addition to total daily protein intake, I think that the distribution of that protein intake is actually pretty important. I think that there's like accumulating evidence to support the idea that how you space that out throughout the day actually probably matters, maybe more than some people do acknowledge. That isn't to say you can't, bolus it, or you can't absorb it if it was all, bolused a little bit more heavily. But I think that if you're looking to optimize, I think that's one thing that you can quite easily do. I mean, most people tend to eat 4 or 5 meals anyway. So I try to space that out somewhat evenly, and I just try to aim for 30 grams of protein in each of those sittings. So for me, my protein intake is usually at least in the range of like 150 to 200 grams per day. And I think that as long as I'm hitting that target, whether or not I get more is just dependent on what it is that I'm eating that day. And then in terms of fat intake, I do think that there is some merit to keeping that somewhat lower. Like when you get up into those higher calorie ranges, I feel like if your fat intake gets carried away, that probably could be bad for nutrient partitioning. I don't think probably isn't fueling performance quite as well as maybe a higher carb intake. So I try to keep my fat sources somewhat to a minimum. So like I'll still go with like lean cuts of beef, try not to like have too much like dirty fast food, that sort of thing. I try to emphasize a little bit more of like a higher carb intake than a higher fat intake. So I do try to keep that below like 90 to 100 grams a day as like a maximum.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting and good for the listeners to hear. And the only other thing I think I personally want to ask about on nutrition before we delve into training is, and I know you're really credit to you, Jeff, for this, because I know you're really honest about the fact that you realize you have pretty good genetics for bodybuilding, and kind of you grow muscle in a good way, and like you look great for what you do. And I don't know whether you put any credit towards the fact that you can almost get away, quote unquote, whether or not there's a more optimal approach out there doing the intuitive eating method because of your genetics, or do you think it's more down to kind of habits you've developed in the past, and it's not getting away with it, it's just the fact this is actually what is kind of going to work for you?
Honestly, I feel like more people could get away with it than you realize, like, quote, get away with it. It's not to like come at you for this, but like you make it sound like it's like a bad thing to just eat, according to preferences and this sort of. I know you don't, but that is usually how it's framed up. It's like, you're being naughty in some way, right? But I think that isn't the way it should be. I mean, like, most people don't really think too much about their nutrition. Maybe some people could think more about their food choices and that sort of thing from a health perspective. But I feel like this is sort of a realistic end goal that I think a lot of bodybuilders can and perhaps should aim to get to. And I don't think I can do it just because I'm gifted genetically or what have you. I feel like anyone who maybe isn't gifted genetically but wants to also have a reasonable lifestyle can do it as well, as long as you pay attention to those few things. You can't just take your hands completely off the handlebars. You have to have some sort of control. And I think that's where that experience thing comes in. Like, I sort of know, I can intuit where and how that control should be applied. But I think that outside of that, I really feel like people could stand to benefit from having a little bit less rigidity when it comes to tracking the macros and all that sort of stuff.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. And right, I didn't mean it in an attacking sense, but you do see people, and I actually wanted to kind of bring it to the attention to the audience that it's not like you don't care. Like, you care a lot about your results. You want the best results, and you'd be doing kind of everything you can to provide that sort of situation. And I was kind of bringing it to the floor where people think, oh, I have to be like that guy bringing Tupperware to meals and things, and I have to make sure my nutrient timing is like bang on, otherwise I'm missing opportunities for growth. And I'm not sure whether that's even worth it. And the actual fact is, you can control a few variables, like looking at your body fat percentage, scale weight, and kind of making sure to dose protein appropriately and kind of eat well overall, a well-balanced diet. And you can actually do really well in your off season. So that's kind of the message I was trying to get across. And I agree. I don't think it's necessarily, genetics. I don't think that's what's kind of going to provide the benefit there. But if we delve into training wise, I definitely think this is going to be interesting for kind of the audience and stuff. And I don't know, first of all, actually, I just want to kind of hand it over to you, Jeff. And in terms of your off-season training, main takeaways, main lessons that you've kind of taken away, like things that you've realized maybe isn't what kind of worked for you that well, and other things that have worked particularly well.
Yeah, I think a big part of this off season for me has been more of a focus on prioritization. So in terms of focusing on really my weak point development, like I alluded to, I think that this whole area up here, like my neck and upper trap area especially, is something that I have the judges have always mentioned. Like, every single show I've done, they said, I think you need a little more upper traps. Like, when you hit that front relaxed pose, you kind of disappear up here. And I think that a part of that, honestly, I think maybe even perhaps subconsciously, is the development of the neck musculature, but yeah, also the upper trap. So that's something that I've really been hammering home, especially for the last year, and I've prioritized that in my training in a number of ways. And biceps is another thing that I found has always gotten critiqued on my own physique, and I think that you really do, as a bodybuilder, need to listen to that feedback and not just run these like generic bodybuilding routines and expect your weak points to improve. For me, I've let some of my strong points take quite a lot less focus in my training, and I've put a lot more of my focus onto these areas. And on my own channel, I just set up sort of my own fundamental series to give people context in terms of like how to plug in all this stuff they're hearing about training and all these different acute training variables. And I think that apart from safety, enjoyment, like this, the whole sustainability thing, and then number 2 on the rung, I put in effort. Like, you just have to apply effort. You have to be willing to work hard. You have to have that right mindset. You can have all the scientific variables in place, and you can know everything about the literature, but if you're not willing to apply that effort, then I don't think you're really going to get anywhere. And having listened to a lot of your stuff, having interviewed a lot of the brightest minds in the industry myself, I've never found a way that can be optimized so well on paper that it can basically get you out of having to put in that work, right? So I rank that actually very highly, and I do think that there's some literature to support that. Some of the stuff on training to momentary muscular failure. There's been new studies on, or there was a new study looking at, and this was in an issue of Mass. I don't know if you've maybe mentioned it on the show or not, but basically it found that like an obscene number of people are training basically below what we would call like an RPE 5. Just it's probably not enough to stimulate any significant growth. And I think that this is why so many people who are just training on these like, I'm going to use the term intuitively, like in a negative context here, but just these like sort of like program hopping type people are just, they just don't have enough effort in place to see significant hypertrophy, I think. So I rank that very highly, and that's something that I apply very strongly in my own training. And then after that, I have a progressive overload and periodization as being another extremely important factor. Before you get to any of the stuff about like volume, frequency, and all that, I think that these are like the kind of the bedrock. And the reason I rank prioritization so highly is because this stuff really does have to be individualized. And that's something that I really realized myself with this off season is if I want to get better at these body parts, I just have to give them more attention than generic bodybuilding routines tend to give. And that's what I mean by prioritization. And it ties in really nicely with the principle of specificity, which is basically meaning you have to train in a way that's in accordance with what your goals are. So I just use the example of bench press. If your primary goal is to improve your bench press, you have to find a way to do more work on your bench press, whether that's like increasing the frequency or training it earlier in the week, earlier in the training session, what have you. You have to find a way to give that priority in accordance with the specificity principle. So it's very fundamental stuff, but it's something that I feel like a lot of guys, especially advanced guys, kind of sometimes will lose sight of, and I found they really get caught up in the acute training variables and forget about just like the basics in a way. So that's something that I feel like I've really come back to, broadly speaking, this off season. Yeah.
And out of interest, when you're talking about kind of the intensity and kind of reps in reserve or RPE, and I haven't actually read the latest issue of Mass, but I did know they did this, and it was quite interesting how people like don't put in enough work. And I know and I think there might be a typical population with it, because I know for myself with my clients, if I program them like a 2 reps in reserve, they'll be lucky if they have 1 rep in reserve. Sometimes like they almost go too hard. I think it's just the type of person I work with. For yourself, obviously you work with intent. Do you kind of periodize your relative intensity? How do you attack that? What are you doing with that?
I would say I wouldn't say I periodize intensity too much, other than to do like the occasional deload or week off or what have you. But for me, for the most part, I'm usually leaving like a couple reps in the tank for my heavy stuff, and then for some of my more metabolic type work, pump style training, I'm not afraid to take those sets pretty close to failure, because I feel like especially with those sets, the failure is a little bit blurred anyway. I mean, like if you get a little bit loose on the technique with those at all, you can extend the set, an extra 4 or 5 reps. So I try to go to that point where I guess in my head, I would call it something like an RPE 9, something like that. And then I'm usually taking this is something I've been doing forever, but I'm usually taking the last set of the last exercise for a body part to failure, sometimes beyond failure, in terms of like doing like some forced reps, drop sets, that sort of thing. And that's something that I do use quite regularly in my training as well.
Cool. And on the aspect, I guess, of periodization, and it was ranked fairly highly in your kind of foundations. What periodization are you using for bodybuilders or for yourself as a bodybuilder? Because I know like some people don't almost believe in periodization for bodybuilding. Other people are very strong with it. Like you'll probably have heard Mike Israetel on the show, and the listeners will certainly know Mike, and he has a strong kind of approach towards his periodization for that. So what sort of approach have you taken?
Yeah, I've been a little bit on the fence about periodization. I think it's more important for strength than hypertrophy. I feel like you can see really appreciable hypertrophy even without periodization. But I guess because periodization is such a like loosely construed kind of like ethereal idea anyway, it's almost hard. Like it would be kind of hard to design a program without any periodization. Like almost any variety even within the training week almost counts as some form of periodization, right? But in my own training, I've basically come, I think to the conclusion that like periodization is really important insofar as it provides variety in training. For me, I do tend to use somewhat of like a loosely block periodized approach. So for me, that usually I find the simplest way and the most effective way in my experience to periodize training is to periodize frequency. So you mentioned periodizing effort. I have done that where like you'll have some blocks where you're like going like almost balls to the wall. It's like very high intensity block. And then you'll have other blocks where you're leaving more reps in reserve, that sort of thing. And I've heard Brad Schoenfeld talk about this as well. And I think there's some merit to it. For me, I found periodizing frequency is the best way to do that. And I basically do that by alternating between some kind of push-pull legs or like a modified push-pull legs that includes an arm day and an upper-lower split where the frequency goes from, say, like almost 2 times a week, or let's say, just say roughly speaking, like 2 times a week up to like roughly 3 times a week. And then that allows me, obviously, when you change the frequency, you can't like keep the volume the same. So like the volume per session will come down. And then when I do my upper lower split, I tend to have a little bit more of a strength focus as well. So I tend to focus more on like, training efficiency, doing more compound lifts, more of like a focus on steady progressive overload. Then when I switch back to my push pull legs, I feel like it's a little bit more of like a flexible structure for me. And then I'm able to basically, be stronger on a lot of the more higher volume stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's been driving progress forward for me pretty freaking well. Honestly, it may sound a little bit simple, like in comparison to some of the more like advanced, I guess, like periodization structures. But I think at bottom, really all that you need to consider with periodization for hypertrophy, or at least I wouldn't say all you need to be concerned with, but in my experience, a big part of it is just how can you periodically vary your training so as to like keep progress moving forward. And that's the way that I've found to be most effective.
No, I completely agree. I think whenever I've tried to make things more complicated than almost they need to be, it makes things difficult to track, difficult to measure, and then I kind of lose focus on what is driving hypertrophy, progressive overload, which is exactly what you touched on. I think the simple methods are kind of sometimes looked down upon, and actually they're the ones that you should probably be focusing most on, especially for bodybuilders, when periodization is, like you say, is a smaller aspect of what we're doing. When we're talking about progressive overload, is there anything you're particularly focusing on? Obviously, you hosted the maximal recoverable volume kind of round table, and whether or not that kind of, after hearing their thoughts and then going through things yourself, is there anything you used from that to kind of make you think about how you are progressing things, especially as like obviously volume is becoming more and more a known thing that drives hypertrophy, so long as you've got sufficient intensity? Has that changed how you train at all, or have you tried things and then realized maybe this isn't all kind of what it's meant to be? Or
I mean, I think, well, that was a great roundtable. Like some of that stuff I feel like is basically setting up like more of a theoretical understanding, so that you can apply it. But for me, it ultimately does come back to like almost like a guess and check over time. Like for me, I've kind of found like a sweet spot in terms of like what I feel like I'm able to do in, an hour and a half training block, that can continue to drive progress forward without me like, running at like an increased risk of injury, or overtraining or overreaching or what have you, without like flirting with that line too much. And with me, like I have been banged up a little bit. Like I've run some crazy stuff, man. Like I've run like, especially like a few years ago, like I've done phases of training where I'm squatting every single day, 6 times a week. I've done very high frequency 6-day a week bench press blocks. I've done like very fancy training protocols, and they can work. But I found that like, I think over the last couple of years, I guess I definitely have become probably like less enamored with like always shooting to be like towards that MRV zone, and more so towards the idea that like over a training career, I think that like some of these minutiae tend to matter less as long as like the effort is in place, if that makes sense. Yeah. And like I've talked to some guys who've been around the sport for a really, really long time, at the top of natural bodybuilding. And I just had a conversation that I'm going to release on my channel with John Meadows.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And I feel like talking to these older guys, it's almost like you really have to find something that's going to allow you to to just follow through with it, be progressive with it over the decades. And, I want to be doing this when I'm 50, when I'm 60. I feel like sometimes trying to like ultra optimize these programs when you're still in your like early 20s or what have you is a way to kind of, you can get ahead of yourself a little bit, and that can set you up for injury. So I guess I've kind of I've landed somewhere in the middle between that like MRV, minimum effective dose sort of continuum or what have you. And I've kind of found like, I think where that spot is for myself. For me, I tend to set this up in like, I guess, a semi-flexible way where I'll have certain exercises that I'm ensuring that I'm progressing on. So like they're going up in some sort of fashion. Mm-hmm. And I'm not always necessarily focused on overloading those with weight or reps. Sometimes I will count, say like a slightly more controlled eccentric as a way of overloading. Or another thing that I've come to start liking a lot is overloading efficiency. So I've been paying a little more attention to my rest periods. So I used to go in the gym and be like, whatever, like if it takes me 2.5 hours, like this is my work. So I'll take however long I need to get the weight that I have to get for this week. But I found that, if you can reduce that rest time in a periodic fashion, just like you would with, say, reps or weight, you're actually basically improving your efficiency in the gym in terms of like your time allotment. But you're also overloading effort in a way because you have less time to let that fatigue sort of dissipate. Mm-hmm. And that is another way to apply overload, especially for those of us who are really busy. I feel like that's another thing that not a lot of people really think about too much. But I guess ultimately it does ultimately come back to those progressive increases for me and allowing my training to have enough flexibility that it's going to be enjoyable enough for me so that I still love going to the gym 10 years down the road. And I think that that's what really matters the most.
No, exactly. And I think you touched on a really good point in that there are so many different ways to progressively overload. And the key is doing something. So you are ensuring you are making things hard and harder over time, and really kind of getting stressed out at what method you're doing that by is not necessarily the thing that should be stressing you. As long as you've got a structure in place and then you can find ways of doing that, then that's really all you have to worry about. And the shorter rest times is definitely an interesting way of doing it, because we actually had recently Borg Fagali on the show. I always pronounce his name incorrectly and pronounced it wrong on that episode as well. But he talked about kind of obviously that method. Every rep kind of is going to be more effective because you're doing it under some fatigue, and that's kind of what you're alluding to there. And I guess in that same sense, if you're doing that, then you're able to do more volume because you're kind of condensing your workout. So no, that's really interesting. And something I did want to touch on is obviously we've talked about progressive overload and that importance, but nutrition is obviously important to this as well. But in terms of like recovery, is there anything you focused on particularly with your recovery? Like, have you sleep is becoming ever known that it's becoming increasingly important? Have you made any adjustments to things that you've done with your recovery that you've noticed have actually really helped things?
Yeah, actually, I would say probably one of the really big things is sleep, especially lately, because when I was, pumping out a lot of these videos, like there would be nights that I would pull all-nighters, I'd be up editing, that sort of thing. And sometimes that's necessary, like, there's a give and a take there. But more recently, I've really started to pay more attention to like having better sleep hygiene, trying to have like a little more consistency in terms of like when I go to bed, when I wake up, and that sort of thing. And I've been getting pretty solid like 8 hours every night, which is huge. It really is so huge. I think even going from like something like 5 to 6 hours up to 7 to 8 hours can make a big difference in terms of your performance in the gym. And there's also like some evidence to suggest body composition improvements. And there's a case to be made for increasing it even further, like going to like 9 to 10 hours a night. If this is really everything for you, it might be worth it for you to try to, squeeze in a nap in the afternoon, or try to, if you can sleep in long blocks of time like that, it may be worth it. There's some research in sprinters to suggest it reduces sprint time when compared to 7 to 8 hours to 9 to 10 hours. And I think that even though that obviously doesn't translate directly into hypertrophy. I mean, we know that like performance is the driver here. So sleep is really, really a big one that I've honed in on. Another thing is, I guess, in a sense, being a little more flexible with my rest days. So there'll be, even though I tend to, so like right now I'll be like, I'm running a push-pull leg setup. If there's a day that comes, like say after a really heavy leg day or something like that, if I'm still sore, I may just take that extra rest day. Cool. Because as we know, 2 times per week it has been shown like pretty much again and again to be better. But like it doesn't end, like your body isn't necessarily on a 7-day calendar, right? Like if we're talking like very, very minor differences between 2 times in 7 days and 2 times in 8 days, like when does that start to give you like diminish or like less returns basically, mm-hmm. right? I don't think it's perfectly clear, and there's so many factors that play into this that I think it may make sense to emphasize your recovery as long as you're doing it in like an honest way. Also, for some reason, this winter has just been brutal on me in terms of sickness. And I feel like if you can avoid getting sick, I feel like that's just such a big thing in terms of like having more time where you're in the gym, even if it's not like the most optimal thing. If you're getting sick all the time, that's like maybe a week where you lost training or lost progress that you would have had if you just hadn't gotten sick, right? So I guess just like doing all the simple things to prioritize your health. And then when you do get sick, I feel like you really just want to emphasize on like, hydrating, resting up, and getting better so you can get back in the gym and then get back into it. And for me, that actually required me to take a little bit of time off. And one of the things that I learned through getting sick so frequently was I do this little sick check. So I would actually go to the gym, whereas a lot of people are like, I'm really sick, I'm not sure if I should go or not or whatever. I would actually go. And I would start with cardio. And because you can, if you're not really, really sick, like if it's just like a head cold or something like that, you can do a little bit of cardio, and that may actually help improve immune function, help expedite your recovery a little bit. So at the worst, you get in a little bit of cardio. And then after doing like 10 or 15 minutes of that, I'll have like an honest assessment while I'm in the gym, whether or not I can follow through with the weight training. And I've used that as a little check to sort of like keep myself accountable through that. But if there's a way to prevent yourself from getting sick, like don't, work yourself to death, focus on, good nutrition, healthy foods, like washing your hands, like, like actually like singing happy birthday or whatever, like, especially if you're doing a lot of traveling and that sort of stuff, like keep yourself healthy, basically. I mean, like that's a pretty big thing.
No, really, I love those takeaways, and actually kind of coming to a bit of a roundup, but I definitely want to touch on kind of next steps for you. But I did want to round up on kind of just my thoughts then. I was seeing the summary of talking to Jeff Nippard, who is a kind of pro-natural bodybuilder, very advanced in everything. And what's really refreshing, and I think a lot of our audience will take a lot away from, because we talk to a lot of experts, they do delve into minutiae, and I mean, overwhelmingly, the stuff we've talked about has not been minutiae. It hasn't been, I'm supplementing with this, I'm making sure to have like carbohydrates at this time, blah, blah, blah. It's very kind of simple stuff that's going to provide the majority of results. And I think that's really refreshing for the audience to take away. So, thank you for that, Jeff. And to finally touch upon kind of future plans, because obviously we talked about whether this year there'd be a contest prep or bare modes continuing for another year, and it'll be 2019. So give us your thoughts on that, Jeff.
Yeah, so I think I'll announce this year. I haven't like explicitly like made this announcement on my channel or anything like that, but I think that this year I'm going to continue to work on those weak points. I've seen a lot of progress in those areas, and I feel like another year will just give me that much more progress. So my plan is to basically focus on my channel, producing the best, most informative, high quality content that I possibly can, get the frequency of that up. I've hired basically a full-time videographer for the channel now, and my goal is to put out 3 videos a week through like some sort of like vlog content, informative content, and then also I'm bringing back interviews. So I'm actually bringing back the podcast, that's basically my main thing this year, is to focus on that. I've really taken such a strong passion to informing, science communication, that sort of thing, and I think that if I can I can do that, I guess, more concurrently with a bare mode bulk than I can with a prep. I feel like if I were to hop into prep, either my prep would suffer, which I really don't want, or my outreach and my work would suffer at this point. And as I'm sure you know, like if you're going to hop into a contest prep, you need to have all of the external variables in a pretty stable place before you do that. And I feel like I don't think I'm quite ready to do that yet, especially with how things are just like steamrolling with my channel and all that stuff right now. So take another year off, focus on the content creation, and then in 2019, hopefully we'll see a much improved and evolved Jeff up on stage. So that's the goal.
Really cool. And I really like that. I think for a lot of bodybuilders, sometimes they might kind of too soon jump into a contest prep, when if you're on something good, like the ball's rolling, let it roll, and just concurrently you're seeing the ball roll with your business and with your physique. So no, that's really exciting to hear about, and yeah, I can't wait to see your channel grow, and I'm sure everyone here is now really excited to hear that you're doing podcasts as well. Just make sure they're not as good as ours, because otherwise we're on that level.
You don't need to worry about that.
No, it's all good. More content the better, because I mean, educating the masses is exactly what we're trying to do here. That's why we've got you on the show, and I love the way you're doing it with the YouTube, because it's just so kind of interactive and informative, and it gets the point across to a different audience. I think the people listening to this might not necessarily watch all of your videos, but I think a large majority of the people that watch your videos probably aren't going to go and listen to this because it's just not the sort of content they're looking for. So no, I think it's awesome that you're doing that. It's really good to see, and I think refreshing, because I think I'm sure the listeners are aware of, like, a lot of YouTube's kind of saturated with a lot of maybe not the best content. So I'm grateful to see that you're doing that. So massive thank you to you, Jeff. I'll stop just blabbing away. I definitely want to make sure, obviously we've mentioned your YouTube several times, I'll make sure that's in the comments below, but you're on Instagram, Facebook, people can reach you over there, so I'll drop those in the comments below as well. Is there anything else you want to kind of leave the listeners with, or if they want to reach you?
No, that's pretty much it, man. Like I said, most of my efforts are into the YouTube channel now, so that's where you'll find most of the stuff from me. But I'm bringing back the podcast. It's going to be the Jeff Nippard podcast. So if you're a podcast listener, I do a similar but just less frequent thing to what Steve's doing over here. But yeah, man, it's been awesome to just see your growth and development on the stage and off the stage. You're killing it in the podcast space right now. So yeah, I'm a fan of the stuff you're producing. So, and it's good to see you've been keeping yourself crazy busy. I can see, so it's good, man.
Thank you so much. Yeah,